My name is Yvette. I work in the Adult Programs Department along with Pat and Joanna. Pat is with us today, and we thank all of you for coming. We are so thrilled that the Commissioner was nice enough to give us his time today, and so thrilled that we have a nice audience for him. I want to thank David Alpern, former Newsweek editor and radio host, who really was responsible for us getting in touch with the Commissioner and actually really making it possible that we could have him today. So I would like to thank him very much. He's done many wonderful programs for us over the years also. And I would like to turn it over to him to introduce Commissioner Bratton.
Thank you, Yvette. First, let me say it was a privilege to review the East Hampton Star, this very timely and important new book by former New York City Police Commissioner Bill Bratton, now a neighbor of ours out here in Hampton Bays. And it was a pleasure to actually meet him earlier this year. For those who missed the 1998 autobiography Turnaround, Bratton's current memoir, The Profession, provides an excellent recap and update of an extraordinary career from beat cop to top cop in Boston, Los Angeles, and New York City twice, but also really a look ahead at the daunting variety of 21st century challenges to the profession of policing now. Even more so in a new epilogue to the recently published paperback edition, which is for sale and signing after we're through. Commissioner Bratton writes about increasingly angry social and political polarization, growing recognition of and concern over racial inequality and injustice, implicit bias, and the ever greater amplifying and distorting role of the media, especially social media, when it comes to dramatic and sometimes tragic police encounters. The Profession details Commissioner Bratton's multi-city record of dramatic crime reduction and demonstrates his sensitive, moderate approach, as well as an knack for charming doubters on both sides of the thin blue line of policing. Quote, "You see us, you really see us," a beloved neighborhood activist called Sweet Alice told him as he left the LA Post. Quote, "The highest praise I have ever received," he calls it. In this time of rising crime, medical and psychological and economic pressures from the ever-evolving COVID pandemic, of escalating, horrifying, and trade-impinging pulverization of Ukraine, plus fear of terrorism, physical, digital, imported, homegrown, ideological, racist, and not to mention more mindless mass shootings with heavier weapons and more controversy over gun control, courtesy just recently of the Supreme Court. In this time, the lessons Bill Bratton has learned and launched could not be more valuable. He'll take questions and sign your copies of The Profession at the end, but first, Commissioner, tell us what we need to know.
A special thank you to the library for this opportunity. My first visit to this library, which is ironic because I love libraries. Effectively, my police career began in a Boston Public Library that was half of a building. The other half of the building was Police District 11. So as a young boy, I would go down to repeatedly check out a book called Your Police, a child book. And I'd make sure I was there at 4 o'clock to watch the cops march 2 by 2 outside of the police station and get back in the back of the paddy wagon and be delivered to their walking posts. Because back in the 1950s, most cops in Boston, like in New York and many cities, walked to beat. Not the case any longer, unfortunately. So thank you to the library for this opportunity. Certainly a shout out and thank you to David. This is the second time he's been able to introduce me, and he also gave me an extraordinary review in terms of, as he basically just repeated to you here. I hope my remarks basically match his in the sense of its comprehensiveness. And a thank you to you. Hi, neighbors. What are you doing here? Beautiful day out there, golfing, tennis, walking, swimming, the beach, and all that physical stimulation. And here you are, hopefully getting some intellectual stimulation. But thank you. My wife, Ricky, who was with me, Ricky Kleeman, a very renowned criminal defense attorney, chief legal analyst for CBS News, the morning show, is here also to cheer me on, and she will be my most significant critic at the end of the presentation on the way home. We have a limited time together to cover a lot of ground, and a lot of ground, by that I mean my professional life in or associated with policing and law enforcement. A career that began, apart from that library, watching the cops march in and out, that began with my military service starting in 1967 for 3 years in the U.S. Army as a sentry dog, military police sentry dog handler, including a year in Vietnam during the Tet Offensive. Returning to Boston in 1970 on the day after my 23rd birthday, joining the Boston Police Department and beginning my career in policing. So that 56-year period of time has been quite a roller coaster ride, with a lot of ups, a lot of downs, a lot of success, a lot of failures. And I'd like to thank the failures I learned from, the successes I built upon. And so what I'd like to do with you today is share some of those experiences that have been memorialized in now 3.5 books that, while he referenced the profession, there are actually several earlier ones. And so it's a trilogy in some respects. That begins with this book, Turnaround, 1998. That in 1996, after working with Mayor Giuliani and after butting heads and contretemps, I left policing as the New York City Police Commissioner, figuring my career in law enforcement. It reached its zenith, and it was over. I went into the private sector to consult on public safety. Fortunately for me, in 2002, there was an opening at the LAPD for the Chief of Police. I applied and successfully achieved that position, and for 7 years I was Chief of the LAPD. So I've had the privilege of leading the two most iconic and two of the most famous police departments in America, if not the world. And in 2011 came very close to being named as Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police in London. But since I was not a citizen of the British Commonwealth at that time, I could not be assigned to the position by David Cameron, the Prime Minister. They subsequently changed the law, but this got a little too old to basically go for it once again. In any event, that the second book during the period after I left LA was called Collaborate or Perish. And I'll reference this book because there's a theme, a central theme that runs through all three. Collaborate or Perish is a leadership management book. It was co-authored, as all my books have been, but co-authored with Zach Tuman, who wrote case studies at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. And the book is effectively about 24 case studies, successes and failures in business, in the public sector, around what works, what didn't work. And out of it comes 8 elements of effective collaborative leadership that have become my Bible, an encapsulation of what I had been doing, but also as I moved into the second phase of my policing career. If you think of it, I left in '96, but that was only at the halfway mark, because then I had LA, and then I had a second opportunity, 2014, with Mayor de Blasio to once again become Police Commissioner of New York. Only 2 people have had that achievement and accomplishment. Ray Kelly, who preceded me in both environments, so we're kind of like checkers, we keep hopping over each other. And we are both, I think, very successful managers of that organization with very different management styles. The third book, the one we're here to discuss and basically speak from, is The Profession. The Profession is a memoir. Turnaround was a biography, my life story up to that point in time, through my stories. The Profession is many stories that Peter Noble, who was the co-author of both of these, had to, with me, interview over 50 subject matter people. And many of their stories are in The Profession. That makes it, I think, a more interesting walk through those 50 years of access to policing. I'm still engaged in policing in some respects, that continuing my police career. I run the risk division for a senior executive advisory firm called tenure, and dealing with all the risks of the world today, cyber, terrorism, executive safety, security. So I keep my finger in the pie in the sense of staying contemporary, now focused significantly in the private sector, but I also stay very involved in the public sector. I'm a significant commentator and contributor to the debates and discussions around American policing and law enforcement, indeed international policing and law enforcement. And at this particular point in time, for the last 12 years, I have been serving on the Homeland Security Advisory Council to the Secretaries of Homeland Security. I have worked for, with one exception, every Secretary of Homeland Security since the inception of that Secretariat. I currently serve as the Vice Chairman of that very important advisory board to the Secretary. So I'm able to stay involved at a national level, international level, on issues of concern for the security of the United States, ranging from cyber to immigration to terrorism. I also basically try to, through my writing, the profession, but op-eds, commentary, appearances on TV, to stay involved, to have a voice, because I think my experiences give me a voice that has some degree of gravitas for the extraordinary times we're living in. The Chinese have an expression, may you live in interesting times. Well, we're not only living in interesting times, we're living in historic times, and whether you think they're good or you think they're bad, they are extraordinarily interesting. To give you a sense of my continuing involvement that helps to inform based on my 50-year experiences, but going forward, my continued interest in the importance of law enforcement and the police in particular to our democracy, that we effectively celebrate our democracy, which in recent years has been extraordinarily threatened from the left and from the right. That just over these last 2 weeks, my wife and I were in London, England, at the invitation of a think tank over there and the Prime Minister's office for a series of lectures and discussions and meetings. I had the privilege of briefing the staff of the Prime Minister at 10 Downing Street on a presentation very similar to this. London is in the midst of an extraordinary crisis politically that you're reading about, but its police force, the third most iconic police force in the world, is in the midst of the worst crises, that's plural, in its history. And I was asked to come and comment on it with my familiarity with what goes on in British Police Services. I was awarded a number of years ago a CBE. I am a Commander of the British Empire, as appointed by Queen Elizabeth. I didn't get to get tapped on my shoulders with the sword, but I was presented with this gigantic medal in Washington at the embassy by the ambassador for my work trying to increase the collaboration between British and American police services. The importance of the British police services goes to 1829, when Sir Robert Peel, then a member of Parliament, was appointed as the first head, as Home Secretary, of the Metropolitan Police, the British Bobby, named after Bobby Peel. And his contribution to policing is the Bible, the platform I stand on. And that contribution, the 9 principles that he established in 1829, if you read them today, they are more appropriate today than they were back then. The first of those principles, and it'll be the foundation of my discussion with you this morning, is, number 1, the basic mission for which the police exist is to prevent crime and disorder. Prevent, not respond, prevent crime, not crime exclusively, but also disorder. Those 5 words are extraordinarily important because I was exposed to those principles early on in my career in Boston as a young police officer, then a sergeant, lieutenant. And then by 1980, I was the superintendent of police in the Boston Police Department. I had a meteoric rise through the ranks of that department, whereas the chief uniformed officer by 1980. I relate all of this because it will inform our discussion here this afternoon about the importance of the police, the importance of the police profession, the importance of the individual officer, the importance of a police department to you and to us, all collectively living in a democracy. The first obligation in our democracy, in our Constitution, echoed in our Declaration of Independence, our Bill of Rights, many of our constitutional Supreme Court decisions, focus on public safety and the effort to ensure that police operate within the confines always of the law. The 3 obligations of police are to police constitutionally, not to break the law, to enforce it, to police compassionately, to remember that we are always dealing with human beings, although some of those human beings are some of the worst people you can imagine trying to deal with. And thirdly, to deal consistently. We're fortunate that we get to spend so much of our time. Many of you live here full-time. Ricky and I are here part-time. We still work and have a place in the city. But we live in an extraordinarily safe environment here. And so the promises of our Constitution are pretty much met day to day. That's not necessarily the case in many cities around the country that I've worked in. So the challenge for police leaders is to try to deliver on those three promises. And the challenge for a police leader, I believe, is also the one that Sir Robert Peel set out in his principles, to prevent crime and disorder. In terms of my career, as I entered policing in an extraordinary time of crises, in many respects similar to what we're dealing with at this moment in our country. Yogi Berra, with his famous twist of the tongue, deja vu all over again. Here we are in 2022, and I think I'm living 1970 all over in many respects. Looking at this audience that many of you were around in 1970, and you might have been with my wife Ricky on the picket lines demonstrating against the war, or you might have been, some of you in blue uniforms like myself, on the other side of those picket lines, protecting federal property against Ricky and her colleagues. She had much longer hair back then and flowers in her hair. Might have been called a hippie back in those days. In any event, let's think of the time of 1970. We were going through the civil rights movement. We were going through the anti-war movement. We were going through an extraordinary societal change in the sense of sexual liberation, freedom, moving more toward the engagement of college students in a way that they'd never been engaged before. And the country was in an extraordinary turmoil. We had had the assassination of the president, the assassination of his brother as a presidential candidate, the attempted assassination of George Wallace, another presidential candidate, assassination of Martin Luther King, leading the civil rights movement. We had a president who effectively, Lyndon Johnson, was driven out of office because of the Vietnam War, despite his many accomplishments dealing with the civil rights movement for example. And in Boston, as I joined that police department, I joined in an extraordinary time of change in American policing. American policing had followed the Sir Robert Peel model in most instances in most cities. It had gone through some turbulence throughout its history dealing with political oversight and corruption, abuse of minorities, inappropriate use of force. So American policing in 1970 was, I would argue, and speak to it in my book, not a profession, in that it did not have any of the hallmarks of what we attribute to a profession. A body of knowledge, research, a leadership that was educated and thoughtful and creative. We had none of the things that you'd expect of the medical profession, the legal profession. And I was very fortunate as I came into that world was changing. For the good, the better, and for the worse. For the good, the national government sought very much to improve American policing, which was thought to be too abusive, particularly at the time of racial tension, too abusive in general. And so effectively, they began a process of national support of education for police officers. Even as I was going through my first 4 years as a police officer walking a beat in an all-black neighborhood in Boston that 2 years before had been an all-Jewish neighborhood, but white flight in response to the blacks moving into the area, that I was attending Boston State College with 100 other colleagues to receive a college education paid for by the federal government. So there was this effort to educate not only the rank and file, but to better educate the leadership of American policing. So the police profession was going through a phenomenal change during that period of time. But society was also going through a phenomenal change, and those of you that may have been of adult age back in that era may remember this. George Kelly, my close friend and colleague, recently passed. Jim Wilson wrote the very famous article, Broken Windows, of which I am probably the most principled advocate and implementer of in the country. I get criticized quite frequently for it, but I believe in it strongly and deeply. The thrust of the broken windows argument was that if you don't take care of the disorder, remember to prevent crime and disorder, you don't deal with the disorder, it becomes breeding ground for more crime. If you don't weed your garden, and you probably have beautiful gardens out here, you know, if you don't take care of it, that garden will eventually kill all the strongest oaks in your garden. And so the same thing in our cities. Starting in the 1970s, policing changed. It changed in a way in which we neglected disorder and focused inappropriately on serious crime. How did we focus on it inappropriately? We measured our success by our response to it, not the prevention of it. Anybody in this room want to raise their hand and volunteer to be a victim of a crime? Just so you can have the satisfaction that the person that murdered you, raped you, burglarized you, was going to be arrested by us after the fact. That's how we began to measure our success in the 70s, and some police departments to this day still measure their success based on solving crime after the fact. And America right now is not doing a pretty good job of that, unfortunately, in the police profession. So that single change in policing in terms of the goal changed the profession in so many ways in the 70s and 80s. Focus on responding to crime, 911. Improvement in the technology, the radios. When I first started walking a beat, my communication was a call box key and a pocket full of dimes. If I had a prisoner, I had to drag him to the call box a couple of blocks down the street, open that heavy metal door, stick my head in, a little mouthpiece there, one of those old phones from the 1920s, and call for a paddy wagon. All the meanwhile, holding on to that prisoner who was fighting with me and hoping he wouldn't slam the door in my head. Otherwise, payphone. Back in the good old days, it was 10 cents, then it went to a quarter, then they basically made a 911 call for free. But that was the communication in the early 70s for cops, by and large. Then we began to get technology, radios, etc. You look at what I was wearing in 1970, and there's several of my colleagues in the room here that from that era. I had my 6-shot Smith & Wesson revolver. I had 6 spare bullets on a loop on my belt. I had a ticket book. I had a badge. I had a patrolman badge, 1190. First woman didn't join the Boston Police Department in 1978. They didn't change the badge from patrolman to police officer in 1988. Things are slow to change in my profession sometimes. And I had a set of handcuffs, and all 150 pounds of me at that time. After 6 weeks in the academy, as I write about in both Turnaround and the Profession, I was out in the streets of Boston protecting the citizens of Boston. God help them. And effectively, that was almost a state of American policing in the 70s. It wasn't quite what you saw in Adam 12 or what you saw in JAGNet. That was the inspirations for me to go into policing in the 60s and 70s, watching the 1950s as television came into vogue. So as we moved into the 70s, society was going through a phenomenal change, but American policing was going through a change that would impact in this country for the next 25 years. That we focused on response. But we also began to do 3 things that George Kelly writes about, the 3 Ds. Society deinstitutionalized the mental institutions around the country. Hundreds of thousands of poor souls who had been in horrible conditions were released from those institutions to be sent home for care at home or to soon to be built newly neighborhood treatment centers. Didn't happen. So what did we do as a society that was still impacted by today, 50 years later, and certainly my profession has been extraordinarily impacted and criticized about our dealing with the mentally ill? We created the homeless population on our streets, many of whom basically had significant mental issues that were not being treated. That's why such a large number of the incidents you see in New York City today about so-called homeless are actually the mentally ill on that population, as well as the drug addicted in that population. So we deinstitutionalized, well-intended. We decriminalized, well-intended, because of the police abuses in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, inappropriate use of force, racism, carelessness dealing with the public. Many of the laws, which is the toolkit that the police officer works with, were taken away. There were many more restrictions placed on us that were not in effect. As I came into policing, it was the stop, question, and frisk decision, Terry versus Ohio, that articulated how to use that critically important tool as a police officer, how to use it legally. And all the controversy you've heard around that these last dozen years was because of the inappropriate use of it not being done within the confines of that Supreme Court decision. So we also had Escobedo, we had Miranda, we had the exclusionary rule, all intended to restrict police actions to stay within the law, to stay within the guardrails. So we now had a decriminalization underway in which a lot of things that we were expected to deal with, particularly on the streets and in public, we now no longer either have the tools or we had many more restrictions on how to deal with it. Public drunkenness. Alcoholism was determined to be an illness. So we used to round up the drunks, take them down to Deer Island, get them off the streets in winter. But now you could no longer do that. That basically you'd have to call for an ambulance to basically take them to the hospital if they're that inebriated. Loitering. Many of the minor disorder crimes that police, when they used to walk a beat, which I used to deal with as I walked my beat, we now no longer were on that beat, We no longer had the tools or the laws to work with, to deal with streets that were becoming increasingly disorderly. The mentally ill, more homeless, fewer tools to deal with them. And the third D at that time, my wife Ricky, as a criminal defense attorney, taught me early on, give things in threes, because the fourth people start to fall asleep on. So the third D was depolicing. You talk about defunding in these last 2 years. Well, we did it in this country in the 1970s in a big way. Britain did it in a big way back in 2011. They got rid of 20% of their cops like that, closed half their police stations, closed their world famous Bratton training academy for their superintendents. And what happened? Crime and disorder went through the roof. No surprise. Now they're wondering what the hell happened. Well, it happened in America in the 1970s. New York City laid off about 7,000 of its then very small police force, laid them off for a number of years in the midst of the extraordinary growing crime problem that they were now responding to, not seeking to prevent. And at a time, because of personnel shortages, as we got rid of all those beat cops, the disorder that was so essential to control to prevent more serious crime was not being addressed at all. You would call 911, you'd want the cop to come down and deal with the drug dealer on the corner, or the prostitute working in the doorway. We wouldn't come. Why? There weren't enough of us, or when we would come, we pretty much just moved them along. We'd go around the corner, and they'd be right back. So our style of policing in the 70s changed dramatically, and a number of us changed. Deinstitutionalization, decriminalization, depolicing. And so in the 70s, we set the stage for the 80s. We had increasing disorder on the streets, fewer police, we're now in cars. 1978, Boston, we got air conditioning, so we could roll up the windows, and we didn't even have to talk with you anymore. We just ride by and wave. And the whole professionalization, it was improving. We were getting better education, better equipment, but we were moving away from collaboration. My second book, Collaborate or Perish. Well, collaboration is the essentiality of the relationship between police and community. But if you're not there collaborating, you're not listening, you're not seeing. The idea of, in the 70s, I was very fortunate to be put in charge of a neighborhood policing program, pilot program, to go into some of the worst neighborhoods of Boston. That's laughable now when you think of the worst neighborhoods of Boston in the 70s versus today. I wish I had bought some of those burned down townhouses back then. I wouldn't be here with you today. I'd be up at the beachfront home up here in Southampton somewhere. South end of Boston, Back Bay, Mount Fenway Park, Boston College, BU. Terrible conditions in the 70s on the streets that I've just described. No cops, the disorderly behavior. And I was asked to basically design a program where we could get the cops back to working with the neighborhood. I went to a number of community meetings, unheard of in those days, to actually ask people like you, come to a community meeting, let's talk about crime in your neighborhood. And I was a computer whiz back in those days with those 2-foot-long green sheets that used to come out of the computer. And I'd be armed to the teeth with all those statistics, the murders, the rapes, the robberies, the headlines in newspapers. And what do people want to talk about? In the worst crime neighborhoods of the city? The prostitute, the graffiti, the gang in the corner, the vandalism. Where are the police? We call, you don't come. The broken windows that Kelly and Wilson, in their very famous 1982 Atlantic article, wrote about. 4 years before they wrote that article, I was living it. And so my policing career for the rest of my life was shaped by my personal experiences, as articulated wonderfully by Kelly and Wilson, who became very close friends. So my whole police career has been based on a number of elements. Sir Robert Peel, the 9 principles. Understanding the basic mission of the police, measure your success on the prevention of crime, not the response to it. You still want to know how many arrests you make, et cetera, how long does it take you to get to a 911 call. But more importantly, is crime going down? Is disorder disappearing? It's a totally different measurement scale. And as one of the first police leaders in America to say, I will allow myself to be measured on how much I can get crime and disorder down. It was unheard of. Because in the 70s and 80s, we were getting a pass from you, the citizens. As you and the political leadership were saying to the police, well, we know you can't do anything about crime or disorder. It's going to be up to society to figure out. Society's going to deal with the causes of crime, which they thought were racism, poverty, the economy, unemployment. Those aren't the causes. There's significant influences from time to time. The cause of crime is quite simply somebody who is a criminal, commits a crime, somebody who in a moment of emotion commits a crime of passion or whatever, or somebody who unintentionally breaks a law, that is an influence in the sense of the way we look at crime. We need to look at the person committing it, and we did not in the 70s and 80s. And we were given a pass by political leadership. We were measured on how many arrests you're making, which drove people crazy eventually by 1990 because they were concerned with over-incarceration, mass incarceration, particularly in minority communities, where so much of the crime was occurring by the end of the 1980s. And what happened in the 1980s, building on the 1970s as police began to disappear from the neighborhoods, even as we got better technology, better police cars, better training, better professionalization, the crime problem was going exponentially. And what was fueling it? One, the fact that we weren't there. Two, drugs. Remember powdered cocaine? Does anybody remember the very famous Newsweek cover? I still have a copy of it somewhere in the basement. Mountain of cocaine on the cover. And the focus of the article was the idea that powdered cocaine, this new miracle drug, you can use it on a weekend and go to work on Monday. No problem. Get high and then you'll be fine. Then we came to find too late that it had extraordinary impact even in its powder form. And then 1985, crack cocaine. Crack cocaine, which across the country decimated minority communities. And with it came the drug dealing, the battling over who was going to control what corners in every city in the country. So that by 1994, when I became commissioner for the first time in New York City, there were over 7,000 open-air drug locations on corners in parks where you could buy drugs and not fear being deterred by the police. The broken windows, the signs of crime. Bryant Park, the celebrated Bryant Park behind the public library, was nicknamed Needle Park. Why? At lunchtime, they'd pour out of those office buildings in droves, not to buy lunch or to enjoy sitting there having lunch, but to buy drugs. And the competition among the drug dealers. So by 1990, the drug-fueled crises in crime, shootings, murders, New York City had its worst crime year in its history, 1990. 2,245 murders, over 5,200 people shot on the streets, over 500,000 serious crimes, rapes, robberies, car thefts, burglaries, and disorder. Disorder everywhere. Remember the subway cars of the 1980s? Every one of them covered totally with graffiti. Shouldn't have felt safe riding around those damn things, didn't you? That in terms of if somebody could paint up a whole railroad car, where were the police and how safe am I going to be? So the 1980s, the only good thing that came out of it from a law enforcement perspective was America finally, in the 90s as we turned the corner, embraced a new concept of policing. And that concept was one I became a champion of in the subway police when I was chief there. And all of this is written about in the 3 books, but most recently in The Profession, in terms of more intimacy, more detail. This is intended to just whet your appetite, basically. 1990, I come to New York the first time as the chief of the then separate transit police force. 4,000 cops patrolling the subways, which were out of control. 3.5 million riders every day, 250,000 of those riders didn't pay the fare. 5,000 homeless living in the subway, many of them emotionally disturbed, narcotics addicted. I think it's bad today. Well, those of you around in 1990, it was a hell of a lot worse. 70 reported serious crimes a day, robberies, rapes, etc. 22 murders in the system in that 1 year. But that paled in comparison to what's going on the streets. But people who want to ride the subways are always more threatening because of the confined space. Well, we were able to turn it around in the subway by the focus on getting the cops engaged to prevent crime, getting the cops engaged to collaborate with the public, getting the cops to basically go after the minor crime. You know, with serious crime, with mapping of it, putting stuff I began back in the 1970s in Boston, put a map of your division up on the wall, put acetate over it, and then put little sticker dots. And within 3, 4, 5 days, you start seeing a hotspot start to develop, a cluster of crime that tells you that's where you want to put your cops. And that tells you what you're going to need to do to deal with that growing hotspot and how to stop it and how to keep it from coming back. So I began that back in the 1970s, and that informed me coming into New York about how to deal with serious crime. But the other issue that I'd also learned in the 1970s in Boston was people were scared to death of the disorder, the social disorder, the signs of crime. You know, the subways, there weren't signs, there were billboards. It was everywhere, it was that bad. So we got the cops to engage. We created various ways to go after that disorder that was stimulating to them, and it was also very effective because it was very visible to the public. That the public could now see these cops actually doing something about the things that had not been dealt with for 20 years. By one way of example, fare evasion. 250,000 people, about 15 theft of fare, $80 million loss a year to a cash-starved transit authority. It is now close to $400 million a year that they're losing with the fare structure in New York City. I met with the head of the MTA chairman the other day. Phenomenal money that had been leading to fare evasion once again. But what we did with fare evasion, I put 10 cops at a subway station where we had a lot of it. 4 of them in plain clothes to stand on the platform and watch for the fare evaders. A sergeant and 5 others in uniform in the utility room. And would snap them as they came over, under, leapfrogging, crawling through the slam gates, and arrest a bunch of them in plain clothes. Uniformed officers would then come in, take them in a daisy chain upstairs to specially equipped buses to process them. The public would see that and say, the police are finally doing something about this. And what do we find? 1 out of every 7 was wanted on warrants for other crimes, oftentimes committed in the subway. 1 out of every 21 was carrying some type of weapon, ranging from box cutters up to Uzi submachine guns. Within 2 years, we reduced crime dramatically and disorder in the subway system. I went back to Boston to become police commissioner in Boston. Giuliani, however, now running for the 2nd time for mayor, knew about what had happened in the subways, talked with Kelly and I, and that's how I became his first police commissioner. You do the same things in the streets. And I said, we certainly can, and we did. 1994, 95, 96, the crime rates dropped so dramatically, historic drops. And for the next 20 years, that crime rate went down every year. The disorder went down every year. Those 7,000 drug locations were gone. The street prostitution was almost eradicated. The squeegee pests were gone. So much of what is being complained about that is back again was gone or under control. 2018, the safest year in the history of New York City. Overall murders down 90%, overall crime down 80%. We had CompStat, the system to track serious crime with more precision. We had quality of life enforcement. So the formula of 1829 was very effective in the 20th and 21st century. Then what happened? 2019, Albany happened. For 25 years, I predicted crime would never go back up in New York City. We had enough cops, we had new systems. Never took into account a crazy legislature and a crazy city council. A very progressive, woke left body of people in both seats of government. Bail reform, criminal justice reform. No argument on the reform. There was always a need to continually reform and keep evolving and evolving the evolution, pleasing going forward. But it was a bridge too far. It wasn't a bridge too far. It was too many bridges too far all at one time. So that by 2020, a year after they began, crime was back, disorder was back. And what you're reading about every day at the front page of the paper, watching every night on the news, thank God it's not happening out here, but it is certainly happening in there. Overall crime in the city is up almost 40% now. Basically, transit crime is up over 50%. And unfortunately, the trending is it's continuing. Why? District attorneys who are spending more time trying to protect defendants than they are the victims. Why? A city council that's more intent on attacking the police instead of working with them. Why? A legislature in Albany that allowed the legal defense attorneys to basically write the legislation without talking to judges, police, and DAs about the legislation. So we're in a mess right now. The good news is, many of you are probably familiar with the movie Network.
Yes.
And the scene where the news anchor opens the window and he's going crazy and he hangs his head out the window. I'm not going to take it anymore. And everybody opens their windows. Kind of reminds you what happened in COVID. Everybody banging on the pots and thanking the medical workers for all the work they're doing. The good news is we are approaching a point now where it is getting so bad so quickly once again that I'm hoping that the public starts opening those windows, and particularly opening the windows up in Albany and at City Hall, and saying the reforms were well intended, but they're not working the way that you would like them to have worked. We need to get back to basically letting the police do what they did for 20 years, control crime, learn from the mistakes of the past, too much use of stop, question, and frisk, too much insensitivity, not enough collaboration. We know how to do this. We're a learning institution like any profession. So I'll close my remarks and open it up for a few questions that you might have with this idea that as bad as it is, the way I look at it, I look for crises. I never want to go into a police department that is being well run and is working. I want to go into something that's a mess. Why? Because out of crises comes opportunity and challenges. Out of crises comes need. The public need to do something. And if you've got the answers for the need, then you can have confidence going in. When I came into the transit police in New York City, nobody wanted that chief's job. There was a black chief down in South Carolina who had been celebrated on 60 Minutes, Jewish black chief who basically went around town on rollerblades. He was the second coming aboard 60 Minutes. They brought him up to basically see, can you take over the transit police? He spent 2 days here and rollerbladed as fast as he could back to South Carolina. I didn't think it could be done. And that was the malaise of the 90s. This like, New York is never going to be safe again. We did it once before, we can do it again. And we can do it this time, learning from the mistakes of the past. In the book, The Profession, and I'm going to close with one quote from this, if I may, but in the flyleaf, it's a quote from the late, great John Timoney, that Chief Carroll was here, remembers John, and John's quote was, those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. We've all heard that one. Those who know the police know we don't know our history. Too many of my colleagues do not know their history because we don't teach it. We don't have a formal education program for cops and chiefs of police about the history of policing. I'm a history buff, so I understand it, I get it. So I learn from the mistakes and the successes of the past. And that's helped to inform what I think has been a very successful career. And hopefully will also basically inform and educate the profession as we go forward into this time of extraordinary crises in our country. The right, the left, drifting farther, the right, drifting farther, the left. Policing needs to be centrist, needs to stay in the center. I'm a centrist. Used to describe myself as a progressive in policing, but that's become a dirty word now, both on the right and the left. So I'm a centrist. I've worked for Rudy Giuliani, who's about as far to the right as you can get now. He's actually fallen off the right. He's gone so far to the right. And I've worked for Mayor de Blasio, who's gone so far to the left, he's fallen left. Two of them are going to bump into each other in case they come together on the other side. So I've worked for Democrats, I've worked for Republicans, I've worked for under Trump in the Homeland Security, I've worked under the Bushes, I've worked under Obama, I've worked under the current president. And I'm a centrist, and that's where law enforcement needs to be. Because as we saw on January 6th, in the paperback version of The Profession, has an epilogue. The epilogue, the publishers came back, Profession came out the year of the George Floyd murder. They wanted an epilogue that would look at 2021, the January 6th insurrection in Washington, with some perspective, my perspective of what had happened on that day and lessons learned going forward. My perspective, and I write about this, might be different than yours, but for American police on that day, Metropolitan Police and Capitol Police, we have the potential to lose our democracy on that day. I truly believe that. And as the January 6th hearings are going forward, we're learning more about that day. So we'll all have our own opinions about it, but the epilogue basically speaks to that. In conclusion, let me read briefly from the book. It echoes a comment that was made by my master of ceremonies, who spoke so eloquently at the beginning, about the concept of seeing you. In the book, I speak about all the stories of the people I've met during that 50-year journey. And one of them was Sweet Alice, born down south in the worst of times in the 40s and 50s, who migrated like so many blacks to Los Angeles, who's now an extraordinary social activist, runs a various number of shelters and programs. She is Sweet Alice. She is just an extraordinary woman who is now well into her 80s. And let me read for you, if I may, that this speaks to, you may recall, Christmas of 2014, police officers Raymond Liu and Leon Raymond Liu and his partner were murdered sitting in their police car in Brooklyn by a character who took the train up from Baltimore, was going to make pigs fly, Rafael Ramos and Waylon Liu. And I'd like to read just an excerpt from the book that relates to that. When I was chief of Los Angeles Police Department, I met an activist in the African-American community named Sweet Alice Harris. The LAPD had long been considered an occupying force in the black community, but I made a great effort to include its people and leaders in our thinking. I was not fully accepted at first, but in time, Sweet Alice and I got on famously. You know why we like you, Chief, she said. We see you. You see us. I love that. I thought it was the vital message that one organization, one community, one family, one individual could give to another. That no one is to be ignored. That every person needs to be acknowledged. That everyone needs to be protected and served and seen. In my eulogy at Christ Tabernacle Church in Queens, I followed Vice President Joe Biden, who spoke about the cops he knew growing up in Scranton and the loss he had suffered in his own life. Governor Andrew Cuomo spoke, and of course Mayor de Blasio. When my turn came, I spoke to Raphael Ramos' children. The most difficult thing any police chief or police commissioner has to do, two of them, being at the hospital when the family arrives and is informed that their loved one has died, and then doing the eulogy at a police funeral. There is nothing more emotional than those two responsibilities for a chief of police. And here we had two of them killed in one incident. We're here because your dad was assassinated. I'm speaking to his children. That's a different word than murdered, which is awful enough. It speaks of the prominence of the person killed. It makes the crime intentional and symbolic. Your dad was assassinated because he represented something, and that's true. He did. He represented the men and women of the New York City Police Department. He was the embodiment of our motto, fidelis ad mortem, faithful unto death. He represented the blue thread that holds our city together when disorder might pull it apart. He represented the public safety that is the foundation of our democracy. He represented the best of our values, as anyone can see by looking at you and at your family. But he was also your dad, a good man who tried hard and sacrificed and had a desire to serve. Raphael Ramos was assassinated because he represented all of us. Even though beneath the uniform, he was just a good man. And he was just your dad. And maybe that's our challenge. Maybe that's the reason for the struggle we're now in as a city, as a nation. Maybe it's because we've all come to see only what we represent instead of who we are. We don't see each other. The police, the people who are angry at the police, the people who support us but want us to be better, even a madman who assassinated two men, because all they could see was two uniforms, even though there was so much more. We don't see each other. If we can learn to see each other, to see that our cops are people like Raphael Ramos and Wenja and Lou, to see that our communities are filled with people just like them too. If we can learn to see each other, then when we see each other, we'll heal. We'll heal as a department, we'll heal as a city, we'll heal as a country. Right now in America, too many of us are wearing blinders. We are not seeing each other, we're looking past each other, we're talking past each other. And the point of these books is to basically talk about maybe doing it in a different way. Thank you for your attention, and we do have just a few minutes.
Anyway, I have a couple of questions to start, and then I'll bring the microphone around to other people for their questions. I wonder what your reaction was to the Supreme Court decision on the New York gun control law and the efforts of other city and state legislators to try to work around to deal with the impact of that decision.
Like those in my profession, my former profession, was still in cities like New York, Boston, Los Angeles, that have significant gun control laws relative to the right to carry a firearm, a hidden firearm. I was appalled because despite the loosening of controls by the legislature the last couple of years, that crime, I think, in New York would be a lot worse if we did not have the gun restriction laws that we have. It's a subject of extraordinary debate in our country. Many states have laws like the Supreme Court has just mandated for the whole country and have not seen major problems. Other states have. We really won't know for a few years until it takes effect. But it's ironic in some respects that what the legislature is now going to do is put in effect, legislature, city council, restrictions on the carrying of those concealed weapons, that you won't be able to take them into libraries, the subway, most restaurants and bars, sporting events, certainly not into state houses and city councils. So the ability to carry a firearm will probably be more restricted than it was before the passing of that constitutional amendment. Only time will tell as to its impact on crime in the city. I personally, based on my experience, am concerned that we see too much rage, too much explosion of rage, too quickly, and having the availability of a firearm. Remember I talked about the criminal versus the more personal moment of passion? What one of you have not lost your temper and done something that you then regretted after the fact? Well, the problem with a gun, it basically, you lose your temper, basically you might lose your life, either being killed yourself or effectively being sent away for life. So the gun issue is one that still roils America and will continue for the rest of our lives.
My other question is about rage. We know that mass shootings are really a small percentage of all the crime that goes on in this country, but of course it dominates the media and it's terribly dramatic. And we always see all of the missed signals. Not the mentally ill, the homeless, but the teenager who was mouthing off and nobody took him seriously or whatever. And the question is, can society afford to deal with all of these signals that have been missed? I mean, if every 18-year-old who said he was going to kill somebody, there's no possibility of following them all, jailing them all. So is dealing with the mental part of mass shootings harder than controlling the access to guns of the sort that are now becoming so common in these mass shootings?
Mass shootings, the new normal, and it is the new normal. They're not going away. We're going to see them repeatedly over and over. They're not going to end in our lifetime, probably not the lifetime of our children. With 400 million firearms in the country, something like 20 or 30 million assault weapons already out there, that despite all the best efforts with red flag laws, etc., we may be able to stop some, reduce and mitigate others. But in a country that is in love with firearms and is controlled politically by those who love firearms, that's the reality of America. The assassination of the Japanese former prime minister, the idea that they have one murder in a country of 80 million people, is an example of that. Australia and New Zealand, after they had mass shootings, basically got rid of all guns in their countries. That won't happen here, so we are going to be stuck with mass shootings, which still constitute, despite the trauma of it, particularly when it involves children, a very small number of the overall murders that occur every day. And also something we don't think of when we think of guns and the ready availability. And this is another thing I worry about the more prolific availability of guns in home or carrying. Suicides. Oftentimes suicides, if you have to get a rope, put it up, and if you have to get the pills and other forms of suicide, you have time to think it through. A gun is a faster solution for which there is no recovery. So guns in the home unsecured, increasing number of guns unsecured. I worry about the increase in suicide. There are more suicides, deaths by suicide, than by murders in this country. Let me go here first. I have two questions over the left. Madam Chair.
As an aside, Max yelled out of my living room window. But my question is, there one deterrent or impediment to the police in New York City, particularly, being able to do a better job that's holding back?
You have a police force right now that is extraordinarily demoralized. I think I'm pretty good at building up morale. Every organization I've gone into to change the culture, and when I left, morale was pretty good. Can you blame them for having low morale? In terms of the city council thinks of them as the enemy. The legislature in Albany is doing everything they can to make their jobs more difficult. And so the idea that 2,000 officers left last year, 1,500 by retirement, 500 by resignation. You'll hear the stories, oh, it's not as bad as it was. It's the worst loss of officers in the last 20 years in a one-year period of time. And it's going to continue. And a lot of that has to do with morale. There are other factors, but this is where it's going to be so important for Eric Adams, who is fortunately, unlike his predecessor, really out there for the cops, going back to Bloomberg, Giuliani, even David Dinkins was much more so for the police. That you don't have political support at this particular time. We'll have to see what Hochul does if she gets elected. We know what Zeldin will do if he gets elected. And hopefully they'll have a partnership between the mayor and the governor, whoever they are, which we did not have with Cuomo and de Blasio, which further compounded the problem. So the better the morale of your force, the more tools they have to work with, the better training to make sure they're not abusing their powers, the better leadership, better supervision. You can effectively have it all. That's why the defeat defund the movement was so stupid. The idea, take money away from the cops when we don't have enough money now to train them to deal with all the things they criticize about, dealing with the mentally ill, dealing with the narcotics impaired, and to also deal with the resentment that's out there now. The average street cop, when I used to pull up in the corner and tell the kids to go off the corner, they'd leave. Now you try to do that, basically they attack you. That there's no respect for the police. So it's going to be an uphill battle, winning back respect from a generation, maybe even 2 generations, that have not been controlled in the sense of their behavior toward law and order. We're in very interesting times at the moment, very interesting times. Okay, please.
Commissioner, former Commissioner, you spoke,
I get to keep the title. I get to If you said chief, I know you're from Los Angeles. If you said commissioner, you're from here.
you spoke repeatedly about the benefits of seeing others, of seeing the other side and people. Can you define that in terms, how can our leaders do a better job at seeing others? And how can we do a better job at seeing others?
In my book, Turnaround, I write about 2 of the most significant learning experiences I had when I was getting my college education paid for by the federal government, even as I was being drawn into the blue cocoon of being a cop. Each day I was going to college, so I was not wrapped up tightly in that blue cocoon, because so many cops just end up getting wrapped up. The only people they deal with are the cops. My 2 best courses, the 2 most influential courses I've ever had in terms of formal instruction, were Dr. Abinaidi's Art Appreciation. That's my Boston accent, Art Appreciation. My college was right next door to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston on Huntington Avenue. And we'd spend half our classes in that museum. And I know what I like in the way of art. Norman Rockwell was my big thing growing up. And I'd look at Renaissance art and just in some of the modern Picasso stuff. I like the Impressionists. But he really taught me to see beyond the picture, to understand the history of it, why that art was so important at its time in history. We're always constantly evolving and changing. We're never static. These things never static. So he taught me several things, that the constant evolution and the need to see what's fueling that evolution, to see behind the picture. And even today, I hate rap music. Don't like it at all. One, I can't hear the lyrics. I'm wearing hearing aids now, but lost half my hearing. I'm a disabled veteran, basically, because of loss of hearing in Vietnam. That I can never hear the lyrics on songs. On TV now, my wife and I basically do everything with closed captioning. What a revolution, and revelation. I can actually understand the plots and the songs now. But, so just that aspect of not hearing the words. So even rap, which I don't like, when you hear some of the words, as long as it's not the gangster rap, some of that, like at Hamilton. What a wonderful, thank God I got hearing assistance when I saw Hamilton. Because the lyrics were just wonderful to that play. So the seeing each other is critical, this idea of not just seeing the black kid in the white t-shirt and the baggy ass pants, or to see that the hairstyle, that, what little hair is left is a pretty traditional hairstyle for my age. And it's, we judge people oftentimes on that first impression. Abinaidi's taught me to basically, as a cop, you judge a lot by your first impression, but you got to get beyond that, so you don't engage in implicit bias or real bias. The second course was Betsy Using, Urban Geography, the history of cities. At a time when America was giving up on its cities in the 1970s, and I saw that in Boston, that people were fleeing the school crises, the housing crisis. The cities are what make us. In the sense of New York, London, that's the future, the mix of people in those 2 cities. And the importance of cities, whether it's coming together so we can see each other. We might not like a lot of what we see, but if we can kind of see around it and understand it, that might help us to be a little more tolerant than we might be. So Sweet Alice with that, again, it's the highest compliment I've ever received. I've received a lot of awards and accomplishments and praise over time. And that one was it, because she got me. That I'm a white chief of police dealing in cities that had tremendous racial issues, and dealing now with all the issues, gay issues, etc., that I think going back to 1973, the Museum of Fine Arts with Dr. Arbonides, he set me on the right path back at that time.
One or two more.
Yes, Commissioner Sean Gear in WSHU, New York. I'm from a cop family, 4 generations, and my brother, my uncle, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather, he was the one that wasn't a city cop. He was a Denver cop, but the initial experience he had was receiving the Congressional Medal of Honor in the Civil War. My kids are in their late 20s now, and they know our background. Uncle Jimmy and great Uncle Dick, they know the job and what it can entail. And being a news reporter and shooting spot news homicides in New York City, I told them what I did too, and they decided not to go that route. Son is a plumber, daughter is a marketing specialist in Hollywood. What would you say to young people today? I know the drill. 1996, I took 2 tests because I was doing the story of them. And I got a 91 for both Suffolk County and New York City. New York City wanted me right away. The detectives came and interviewed my neighbors and my mom and my, but Suffolk County, I was 7,000 on the list. Because
That has changed. The waiting lists are long gone for many departments. Not the case out here in Suffolk and Nassau, although they are smaller than they were. New York is having a hard time for the first time in almost its history attracting what they describe as qualified candidates. In response to your question, as I understood it, what would you say to young people today? It's exactly what I've been saying to them for the last 20, 30 years. And it's a paraphrasing of a quote from Gandhi. I love quotes, historical quotes, I love history. And the quote from Gandhi that I use is, to create change, you must become the change. You're not happy with the police. And Eric Adams is kind of an example of this. You know, he talks about his very troubled background, being beat by the police, and that he came into policing with the idea he was going to change it. He became very active in support of black officers, mayor of New York City. So he's the embodiment of that. If you don't like what you're seeing, then basically get in there and try to change it. Don't just stand in the arena and yell at the people, the combatants in the arena. Get in there and change it. I'd like to think I'm somebody that I came in consciously, wanted to just be a cop, but within a few years I wanted to create change. And I've sought environments where I could do it. I wanted to come to New York. Why? Because it's the biggest soapbox in American, if not international policing. The old adage, you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. Well, we made it in New York. CompStat, crime turnarounds, that we made history. And when I talk to my young cop recruits, or soon to be, or wannabe recruits, I talk about cops count, police matter. The individual action of every cop every day, that counts. We saw it can count negatively, Chauvin in Minneapolis, murdering George Floyd, or the heroism that we so frequently see of cops basically, not happening, what happened in Uvalde, unfortunately, but most of the time cops run toward the danger. And the idea of police matter, your police profession matters. Because we could not, as we saw on January 6th, without the police profession, that thin blue line on that day, we might have lost the democracy that is basically what we so cherish. So there's no career that offers an opportunity every day to have a life of significance. I think I've had a life of significance. I think I've been active. I look back on my career, its ups and downs, and I'm pleased with where I am and my contribution. The reason for writing the books is to contribute so that others might learn from my successes and my failures. And I talk openly about some of the failures. Giuliani was a failure for me. I didn't learn to effectively collaborate with him. So he was somewhat the inspiration for Collaborator Perish in the second book. That rule number 7 of leadership in Collaborator Perish, stay in the headlights of the person you work for. In my case, police chief and mayor. In his case, I didn't stay in the headlights. I went over the guardrail, down the ditch, took the car, and ended up hanging upside down by my seatbelt. That lesson learned. Every mayor I've worked with since then, I learned to basically collaborate successfully with. So it's stories of successes and failures. One last thing, I know, because one last question, and then we'll break that. And I have one little giveaway before we go.
Thanks, Bill. I want to refer to two incidents that are very troubling to most police across the country. One was a summer or two ago where police officers were walking to the radio car and water was thrown at them, and they just continued on to walking like it never happened. And then just recently we saw several young children in diapers and underwear berating police officers, cursing the language you never heard of. And I know through our efforts over the years, through Police Executive Research Forum, which you were president, and John Timothy was president, and O'Neill, we reached out, we collaborated, we broke our backs to reach out to the community and work with them. And now this is like, how do we get back to that? How do we reverse the feelings that we see in these two incidents?
That's the crises I've talked about, the idea of the challenge that crisis creates. Those two young officers, basically I think all of us that were either in the business at that time or associated with it, were not happy with that walkaway. Although we spent a lot of time with our officers training them to de-escalate. But there's a time to de-escalate, and there's a time to basically be a little more forceful in response. You cannot basically allow that type of open disrespect, because those two officers set the stage for the next two that would show up in that corner, and that crowd would be emboldened. Well, we basically threw water at those first two. Let's see what we can throw on the next two that show up. So you can't lose. Respect also is respect for authority, respect for the individual, and they totally lost respect for the authority and the individual in that incident. In terms of those young children, they're what, 2, 3 years old maybe, the language, incredible. What the hell type of family environment are those kids growing up in that they were like that at that particular time? But again, that's the idea of seeing behind what is going on in that home environment. One of the first things I would have done there was basically get the social workers down to that family and see what's going on in that family, that there's so much anger and toward the police. And that's the challenge, that we were in a time where, quite clearly on January 6th, that the so-called law and order crowd didn't have much respect for the police on that day, did they? And despite touting that they were all about law and order, when it went against what they were intending to do, that so much of the cops were going to go right over them. And thankfully, the cops basically held the line, tried to hold the line.
On behalf of everybody, Commissioner, thank you very much.